Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. As you know, on this channel I've called out several professors who, instead of doing their job and teaching their subject in the most academically neutral way possible, use their position to do political activism. Well, today we have another one of those. The name of the professor in question is Roberto De Mattei. He's an Italian historian, teaches at the Sapienza of Roma, and is professor emeritus. Now, as you know, on this platform I've promised that I would debunk nonsense regardless of what side it comes from, and believe it or not, in this case it's coming from my side, in the sense that the man is a Christian and is allowing his own personal beliefs to skew his interpretation of history for the sake of pushing his own messages. Over the years I've debunked all sorts of activism coming from both sides, and today, as a matter of intellectual rigor, I will do the same. To me, it doesn't matter if the nonsense comes from the left or the right, or as in this case from the Christian perspective. If it's nonsense and it has to do with history, I'll debunk it. There are several statements that the professor made publicly, some of which during many interviews in a popular radio station and articles all over the internet. Professor De Mattei claims that ancient Rome fell because of homosexuality, that barbarian invasions were a punishment from God, that Carthage was destroyed once again because there were too many gays, that the tsunami in Japan was a punishment from God to the Japanese, that the earthquake in Messina, Sicily, which happened a few years ago, was once again a punishment from God. I think you can see the pattern here. Every time that there is mass death, whether it be through war effort, natural disasters, societal collapse, economic struggling, it's God punishing people. Now, if this was just a matter of personal belief, then as a person who believes in freedom of speech, I would say, hey, who cares? He can believe whatever he wants. But the problem is that he's in a position of authority and he constantly pushes this message while at the same time being one of the leading teachers of history in one of the most prestigious universities in Rome. And not only his books are riddled with these notions, which completely fall flat the split second you look at the actual real reasons as to why any of these things happened, and I will share them here, but it does beg the question, is this how he teaches history? As you know, on this channel, whenever I do make videos on any subject, I try to approach them from a secular standpoint, particularly when talking about history, social issues, historical politics, and linguistic matters. And I do that to maintain and ensure a certain level of intellectual rigor in my productions. Besides, and as I will explore more in details later on this video, this sort of explanation falls flat not only in comparison to the real historical, economic, military, and social reasons as to why certain extreme events occur, but it defies logics. Think about it for a moment. Carthage was destroyed because they were gay as a punishment. So what you're telling me is that all they did before that, idolatry, worshipping of false gods, slavery, murder, crime, invasions, injustice, possibly child sacrifice, cruelty to prisoners, torture, greed, all sorts of evil, all of that was fine. It did not call for God's punishment, just as long as I don't get gay on me. That's where I draw the line. Utter destruction then. In ideologically driven positions, even the logic ceases to function. His personal politics, once again his own freedom, appear to be quite extreme. In fact, he has managed to upset both conservatives and progressives in Italy, including conservative Catholic historian Archbishop Agostino Marchetto, who calls his productions and books ideological and hyperbolic. Last but not least, on this article, among other things, as I was looking into his own personal politics just to have an idea, and to clarify, I looked into his politics after I debunked his statements, which I recorded before looking into it, to avoid any possible selective bias on my end. When it comes to his own personal political affiliation, at least publicly, he has an entire blog where he criticizes and attacks the center. In other words, by tweaking a little bit the words here and there, he fundamentally considers centrism and moderation as a danger. He attacks all forms of left-wing positions, whether it be socialism or communism, but also has a bone to pick with the center-right in Italy. And by reading this, the idea that comes out is that of some sort of theocratic position, which would be the exact opposite to the notion of the separation of church and state. Now listen, I've made a lot of content debunking the LGBTQ activists that try to spam modern concepts into classical antiquity, the medieval period. I remember this channel saying the medieval knights were encouraged to have homosexual relationships. Like, all of that nonsense I've debunked multiple times. But this idea of Rome falling because of the gays, it's the, oh my gosh, it's as stupid as it gets. Outrageous top Italian history professor blames fall of Rome on rise of homosexuality. Fall of Rome. A professor is facing calls to resign after blaming the collapse of the Roman Empire on homosexuality. Now, Gibbon, of course I disagree. It's nonsense to say that it was because of gay people that Rome fell. There are specific reasons, which are economic, military, immigration, foreign policy related. There is a lot. I'll tell you in this video. Of course I will. And it's such a complex picture that to say, oh, it was the gays, it's the stupidest thing ever, because it demonstrates that you haven't studied the actual phenomena, like what happened. I would cancel a person's job, although then again, teacher of history, that's the thing, then has this opinion. I think he should be allowed to share his opinion. It's a stupid opinion, and I will debunk it, but I wouldn't block him. I think freedom of speech should still be allowed. But then again, if he teaches history, then he teaches this during his classes, then we're getting into a problem of not necessarily canceling, but a problem of professionalism. Why does he even have that job at that point? Roberto De Mattei, a devout Roman Catholic, has already raised eyebrows by saying the Japanese tsunami was divine punishment. As a devout Christian, with a family that, of course, is Italian, Roman Catholic, the majority of my family is Roman Catholic, what were the Japanese being punished for is the part that I'm not sure. To connect it, it's a natural catastrophe. I do not believe. If you want to believe that this was divine punishment, believe whatever you want, but I'd like you to motivate it. Like, what were the Japanese being punished for would be my question. I don't believe it's the case. In a radio interview, the vice president of Italy's prestigious Center for National Research said, open quotes, the collapse of the Roman Empire and the arrival of the barbarians was due to the spread of homosexuality. Okay, so this is even worse. It's not just the Roman Empire collapsed because of homosexuality, but also the arrival of the barbarians was due to homosexuality. So what? Oh my gosh. So basically, Rome is having all of these gay people in the streets, like doing all of their gay stuff openly, apparently, even though we know that's not the case, but whatever. So Rome is having all these gay parties, and then barbarians hear that, they're like, ooh, they're having gay parties. Let's go, mate. And that's why they invaded, to get the gays. Oh no. Oh my god, the movement of the people of the steppes, the barbarian invasions, the collapse of the frontier, the problems of the frontier, all the military situation, all of that, because, so they invaded because of homosexuality. Well, couldn't they have their own homosexuality in the steppes? Oh, I can't believe it. Oh, let's go. Rome is full of homosexuals. Let's get on a horse, Tom. We need to get to the homosexuals in Rome. Oh, this is making my day. Now listen, already, if anything, the late Roman Empire was Christianized. So if anything, there was less homosexuality. Probably the same number of homosexuals, but early Christians will be repressed. Gay people always existed, in fact, same-sex attracted people, I want to say since the dawn of time. Yet, depending on the situation with religious authorities and all that, and in general, how it's taken by the public, they might need to hide it. You can't blame the fall of the Roman Empire during the dominate to the rise of homosexuality if it's a period of Christianization. It makes zero sense. If anything, it shouldn't have fallen. If that's the logic, so homosexuality makes the whole empire fall, but now the empire is Christianized and you're a Christian, so you're thinking that Christianizing the empire did nothing. If anything, the homosexuals were... It's ridiculous even by his own logics. The reality is that if you study the fall of the Roman Empire, which, by the way, is still discussed, it's debated, there are lots of possible reasons. As I say, I'll share some here and my own personal interpretation. But this is just a cheap attempt at attacking for social reasons, for whatever it is. If Mr. De Mattei was on his social media platform and saying, I don't like gays, all right, say it, whatever. But the fact that they have to connect it to the empire in order to create this sort of fear-mongering and demagoguery where they're trying to tell you, see, the Roman Empire fell because there were gay people, so we could fall as well if we don't get rid of the gay people. That's the idea. And it's not, it's ridiculous. Don't use history like that. It's a disingenuous way to do it. Voice your concerns, voice your preferences. I'm a very pro-traditional family man, but that doesn't mean that I need to go and make up nonsense like this. Not to mention what consenting adults do. It's their freedom. And I would defend that, regardless of my Christian beliefs. I would not take away the ability, as long as they're adults and they're consenting. What they do is not my business, in the privacy of their home. Not my business. The Roman colony of Carthage was a paradise for homosexuals. There you go. And then, because he needs to do this, he ends up pushing the same nonsense that the LGBT activists push. The activists, not the regular person. If you're just a regular gay guy, and I'm not attacking you, I'm talking about the activists that say stuff like this. They say it about Rome. They say it about ancient Greece. We know it's nonsense. And now he is pushing the same agenda. So he's doing it's the other way around. People like this will end up pushing the same agenda because they say the Roman colony of Carthage was a paradise for homosexuals and they infected many others. This is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous quote. It was not a paradise for homosexuals. Neither was Rome, neither was Greece. This is a point that in ancient Greece, just like in ancient Rome, the situation was very stigmatized. Yes, it was more accepting towards homosexuality, some degree. Certain situations in homosexuality were more accepted than, say, medieval England or medieval Italy. I mean, duh. I mean, it's pretty obvious at that point. But regardless, I wouldn't say that ancient Rome or ancient Greece were more accepting of same-sex attracted people than we are today. I wouldn't say that. A lot of these situations where they say it was a paradise, it means, everyone was free to do whatever they wanted and love is love and we should look at that model and recreate it. No, you don't want to recreate it, because if you wanted to do that, then you have to imagine that if you were caught in a relationship that wasn't admitted by the culture of the period, meaning that, say, two men of same status, they can't have, you can't be his boyfriend. In fact, if anything, if you do that and you break the norms of classical antiquity, which are very strict when it comes to this, it's just a matter of passive and active, and the active needs to be the highest social status and also possibly with a younger person, sometimes even more young than we are comfortable with discussing even. But regardless of those situations, if the upper person in society is actually being the passive person in the relationship, then what's going to happen is that they're going to lose their access, they're going to lose their career, are not going to be able to become magistrates. Why? Because it's stigmatized. And not to mention that, but if you read philosophers in ancient Greece, some people were pro homosexuality, but then again, not in the modern sense. Some people were pro these kind of relationships that were based on these positions of power, but still there were people that were strongly against it. There were people that write stuff that today would absolutely get you called homophobe, and yet they're from ancient Greece, and they're important philosophers. And then you also get people that don't care. In my opinion, that's the majority of the population, by the way, because when we look at same-sex relationships, the way we read them, the famous ones, it's always the aristocrats, it's the rich people, is the emperor of Rome. Sometimes if you look at someone like Elagabalus or even Claudius, Hadrian had a situation like that, although it was with a minor. Regardless, these do not represent the majority of the population, and how could they, considering the fact that same-sex attraction is a minority, of course. And therefore, if it is a minority, it means that the majority of the population either didn't engage in this sort of relationships because they were straight, as the majority of people are, or they would not care about it. Because it doesn't matter. If you're a farmer, you just want to go farm. If you're a soldier, you're doing your job. You're not there thinking, I need to go on social media and fight for the rights of gay people. That's not classical antiquity. So this idea that it was a paradise, whether it be Carthage, whether it be Greece, it's not true. In fact, it's disrespectful towards those people that had to sustain a difficult life compared to today, where you can have people that are same-sex attracted and we are not stoning them. Okay, that's a massive difference. Massive difference. The 62-year-old added that the invasion of the barbarians was seen as a punishment for this moral transgression. Oh, that's how he connected it. Goodness gracious. Homosexuality was not rife among the barbarians, and this shows God's justice comes through history. What? How do you know? How do you know? The causes of the fall of the Roman Empire are multiple, difficult to summarize and put together into a pattern, and to this day they are not agreed upon by all scholars of the subject. However, one can try to construct a general discourse by analyzing various internal and external contributing factors, starting from the first attempts at analysis carried out by historiography. The first to address the issue in depth was the English scholar Edward Gibbon, according to whom the original cause of the fall of the empire was to be found in a generalized social crisis, which was reflected in several factors, all related to the protection of the state by its citizens. According to Gibbon, ease and wealth would have progressively distanced Roman citizens from military practice, who would have gradually delegated the defense of the empire to militias formed by barbarians. These militias, grown disproportionately in number and influence, amid power struggles and a lack of foresight and planning capacity, would have led the empire to collapse. And even though this approach by Gibbon, do keep in mind that it is now considered outdated and quite shallow itself, although in comparison to the idea of it was because they were all gay, it is already orders of magnitude more significant. Gibbon's vision, while certainly offering some interesting points of reasoning and having undeniably set a precedent for Roman historiography, is now dated and suffers from a series of ideological elements typical of his time. To the aversion to religion, which was characteristic of the Enlightenment environment, Gibbons adds archetypal categories that we now know to be the result of cliché and commonplaces, such as the soft and decadent imperial Roman, now rendered effeminate and unwarlike by too much luxury and ease, in contrast to the virile but impulsive and warmongering barbarian. Dear noble ones, if you like this video and you would like me to continue to annihilate this absolute complete utter nonsense, regardless of any possible backlash, please consider getting one of my plushies. This way you can support me bashing these lying cretins into outer space. Thank you very much. Link in the description. Come on, do it now. You know you want me to continue. Come on, show me the fiber of your fabric. Link in the description. Therefore, if any student wishes to sort of deepen their understanding of Gibbon's position, you need to keep in mind that his ideas and concepts must be analyzed through a critical eye and should be considered as a basis to build upon. According to the historian Giovanni Brizzi, the seed of the fall of the Roman Empire is formed in one of its moments of greatest splendor, when it is not yet an empire in the strict sense but a republic. Rome's victory over Hannibal in the Second Punic War effectively leaves the Romans the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean. In other words, the crumbling of Punic hegemony, which will never recover, will leave Rome without a sort of opponent or a counterbalancing within the Mediterranean basin. And the capital being injected with the war indemnities imposed on Carthage and the conquest of the silver mines of Spain will provide Rome with an economic capacity and impetus that will allow it to confront and subjugate a good part of the Hellenistic world in a relatively short time. In just under a century, Rome will enjoy an enormous increase in wealth and enter an economic system firmly based on plunder and assimilation, with an exponential domino effect that will, however, physiologically end in the 2nd century, when the desirable lands that could justify the growing expenses for the mobilization of the military machine have simply been exhausted or are within a military and politically solid system that is difficult to confront, namely the Sassanid Empire. At this point, Rome, in order to maintain its structure, must necessarily turn mainly towards agricultural production and to a lesser extent commercial activities, but it is evident that the standards established by the previously aggressive model of military economy are no longer sustainable in the medium term. All of this will lead to the economic crisis of the 3rd century, which will further exacerbate the already problematic relationship between the upper class and the elites and the rest of the populace of the empire, and this will lead to another problem, namely the migratory flows of the barbarians. With the end of the wars of conquest, the empire had to live off agriculture, but increasing the total agricultural resources were virtually impossible. The agricultural and industrial technology of the time was not as advanced as that of Europe in the late Middle Ages, making the the process of resource production much more burdensome and inefficient. In other words, this economic decline in Europe was also caused by the excessive taxation and the fiscal burden that was borne by the producing classes, which reduced in its way, as a result, or a symptom should we say, the effective numbers of the agricultural population within the productive sense. Hence, the presence of a large and productive portion of the population, namely that assigned to the bureaucratic and military apparatus, further aggravated the fiscal burden and reduced the available agricultural workforce. The size of the empire, on the other hand, made an articulated bureaucratic apparatus a necessary element for its management, and the pressure of the barbarians at its borders made a large army equally necessary. At the same time, the discontent of some of the humblest strata of the population, caused by the continuous tax increase, gave rise to the outbreak of population revolts that, starting from the end of the 3rd century onward, first flared up in Gaul, then also in Africa and the Near East, carried out by entities respectively called Bagaudae, Circumcelliones, and Maratocupremi, which, beyond their respective local cultural peculiarities, seem to share a peasant origin, a rejection of imperial authority, considered incapable of managing the pressures of the barbarians, and at the same time perceived as overbearing and rapacious. These groups of rebels were also characterized by a very superficial urbanization and in some cases adherence to Christianity. Unlike what Gibbon expressed, Christianity does not appear to be so much one of the factors of the empire's decline, but rather in this initial phase of the crisis, it seems to continuously gain consensus among those most oppressed strata of society. In any case, the high instability caused by the peasant revolts, which will flare up with particularly virulence in the 5th century AD in Gaul, will lead to the need for a large and reactive military apparatus, which, from an economic point of view, will end up further aggravating the economic situation, now plunged into a vicious cycle. If you appreciate my content so far and wish to help ensure my ability to continue to tell it how it is, regardless of any possible backlash, please support this channel on Patreon. Any support helps me and my team of academics keep the channel strong and gives us the means to fight back against the political rewriting of history. Stand with us, form the wall, defend the truth. The term Barbaricum refers to a set of territories north of the Danube and east of the Rhine, inhabited mostly by Germanic but also Indo-Iranian peoples, such as the Sarmatians. We're usually used to imagining the Barbaricum as a uncivil, so uncivilized, sort of wild and most importantly antithetically opposed area compared to the Roman Empire, but that's not really the case. The way we should imagine Barbaricum of this period is to think of a place that was more like some sort of poor periphery in comparison to the center of the empire, but which was still very strongly culturally and most importantly technologically influenced by the Roman presence. This is a fundamental fact to keep in mind because the barbarians objectively never wanted to destroy Rome. The idea of the barbarian rising among the ruins and moving to demolish the foundation of the empire is the result of a romantic imagery, but has very little to do with historical reality. In reality, the barbarians always wanted to enter into the Roman system, and not necessarily in a violent way. Even before Rome became an empire, the mixed migrant communities of Germanic and Celtic peoples of the Cimbri and the Teutons, before giving battle to the legions of Gaius Marius, had insistently requested territories to settle within the Republic in exchange for their services as fighters, and only faced with the clear and repeated refusal of the Roman Senate would they resort to violence. And the same, as we know, will happen again with the Gothic people. So in order to understand the rather complicated relationship between Roman authorities and the Barbaricums, or the barbarian world, even though of course it's a case-by-case scenario, but we do need to keep in mind that this will be somewhat of a constant. These barbarians don't want to invade Rome to destroy it. Rome is in fact something not to be hated, like we are often presented in movies and games, but it's something to be envied that they wanted to be a part of. A model to strive for, not something to destroy. Now of course we remember figures like Arminius, Vercingetorix, and Queen Boudica, who opposed Romanization. But if when Rome expanded its borders, there were certainly members of the elite of the indigenous population who opposed the conquest, later the barbaric realities left outside often sought to work to become part of that economic and social structure they saw close to their borders and perceived as a desirable achievement. Faced with these movements aimed at infiltrating and pressing on the borders, the Romans initially show excellent management skills, and when it is not possible or profitable to eliminate these masses or to move manu militari, so with the army, as Gaius Marius had done, the Roman administration takes care of moving and relocating their barbaric tribes along the limes of the empire, so the external border, externally or immediately within its borders, managing and filtering their flow and ensuring that the different barbaric communities counterbalance and keep each other under control, relying on militias of barbaric extraction manages, at least temporarily, not to distract the population of the empire from production. And the large landowners end up paying the state taxes as a substitute for the military service of their agricultural colonists. And the capital, thus injected, is intended for the payment of the barbaric militias. And what this system ends up creating is not only that the Roman Empire is now utilizing these barbaric armies in the borders in order to keep the other barbarians at bay, and they pay them well, but what happens is that they also start promoting some of these now veteran warriors and soldiers and put them within the ranks of the citizen Roman armies, all the way up, sometimes even to the level of supreme commanders who were under the direct command of the emperor. That is a huge change with previously internalized and sort of citizen-only structures and schemes. This change also led to closer ties between the great senatorial families and the leaders of barbaric origins, including marriages that contributed to increasing their social status. The birth and proliferation of exponents of this new Romano-barbaric nobility, however, brings with it a germ of profound instability. The historian Giovanni Tabacco writes, "The assimilation of the Germans of senatorial dignity into the aristocracy of the empire might therefore appear perfect, but their origins was not forgotten, because it placed them in a special relationship with all the non-assimilated Germanic groups of the empire, present in a conspicuous way in the armed forces and within the empire population, now allies, now enemies of the empire." Having reviewed all of this in more details, a student can begin to understand the military and political implications of such new practices, which will be tremendous. What plunged events into a frantic and destructive spiral was the appearance on the European scene of a new people, the Huns. Arriving from the northwestern borders of China, the Huns, originally a warrior aristocracy of perhaps Siberian, perhaps Turanian origin, had involved in their movements in the steppes of Eurasia a whole series of people. First, Turanians, then Indo-Iranian, finally Germanic, going to form a tremendous critical mass that struck with unprecedented force on the Barbaricum. With the unstoppable advance of the Hunnic horde, the migratory push of the Germanic population towards the borders of the empire, which was previously considered as an opportunity, it now becomes a painful necessity, and above all, increases exponentially in intensity and volume. Unable to manage a pressure that had grown so suddenly, the imperial authorities often failed to engage constructively with the migrant masses of the barbarians, often fleeing the Barbaricum and seeking protection from the Huns within the borders of the empire. And to this point, we can connect it to something that actually happened historically, which is the idea that a lot of these fleeing barbarians that were running away from the Huns of Germanic origins within the empire, well, they were exploited, they were taken prisoners, their loved ones captured into slaves, their possessions taken from the Roman authorities, which then changed what could have been, from a modern perspective, refugees that could have allied with you against the common enemy, the Huns. Well, they were turned into, once again, more hardened enemies. Not a great strategy. Julius Caesar would not be proud. These people sometimes would join local revolting peasant masses in a crescendo of chaos and devastation. In this terribly compromised picture, the warlords, who are exponents of the Romano-barbarian nobility, find ideal room for maneuver, exploiting their contracts, alliances, and kinships both inside and outside the Roman world, beginning a game for power aimed at securing control over the provinces of an empire now in shambles, but increasingly more appealing than the forests and steppes of the Barbaricum, with a view to establishing their own independent powers. All of this societal, political, and economic havoc will culminate in the birth of the Romano-barbaric kingdoms in the beginning of the Middle Ages. If you think that being gay will make an empire fall, and if anyone looks at this closer, and looks at the data and sources, you will see that just like today, also at the time of the Romans, the idea of same-sex relationships was accepted by some, condemned by others, and ignored by many. Because humans are humans, and civilizations do not change dramatically when it comes to these societal issues with just a couple of thousand years.
Do you want me to tell you a little bit about homosexuality between... I'll probably make a dedicated video at this point, one of these, since I'm the only one who can do it from a moderate perspective without trying to push politics onto these things and maybe just look at the facts. Last night, fellow historians, gay rights groups and politicians expressed outrage. I'll look into the fellow historians though, because when it comes to the activists, it's not like the outrage, I understand it in this case, because he's speaking nonsense, but then again, the activists push their own nonsense, so it is what it is. Paola Concha, an MP with the Democratic Left, said, open quotes, "I have tabled an urgent call for Education Minister to intervene." I don't care about left, right, all of that. Let's just look at the facts. Italian homosexual group said the professor's comments were based on superstition, ridiculous and outrageous, and called on him to resign from his Rome-based post. Historian Emilio Gabba, a leading light in Roman history, said, open quotes, "It is highly improbable homosexuality led to the fall of the Roman Empire." Yeah, I mean, you could remove improbable. It's not a thing. It's not a thing. No one who looks at the history seriously. If you want to talk about it from a religious point of view, we can discuss, we can talk, whatever you want. But from a historical standpoint, it makes absolutely no sense. You can remove improbable. You can remove improbable. Professor Lelia Cracco Ruggini, an expert on Roman history from Turin University, said, open quotes, "There is no proof Rome had a high number of homosexuals." Finally, this is the non-political truth. This is true. Why would they have a higher number of homosexuals? You're either homosexual or you're not. Now, given there may be situations in which someone is forced to go into it, but he's not a homosexual, he's a victim in that point, right? Particularly if they are young. So yeah, this is correct. This is probably was just like, this is right. I can safely say Rome did not fall because it was gay. Absolutely. However, research would seem to suggest homosexuality was rife in ancient Rome. Well, but then again, what do you mean by rife? Rife meaning common? It wasn't common, as we established. No one seems to, I don't know, maybe people are afraid to speak up because the activists are going to get pissed. Well, I'm going to do it. I'm going to say it. It doesn't matter. That's what the data says. We have specific, we know that. They had a different approach to sexuality than we do today. Very, very different. Which is why taking LGBTQ ideas that are modern and putting them into classical antiquity is out of place. You can ask me questions and tell me, hey, how was the life of someone who was same-sex attracted? And we can sit down and talk about it. I'm just here to tell you how it was based on the sources. Trying to say the Vikings were transgender, then you're trying to push an gender dysphoria as a way of suffering probably did exist. But transgender and they, them, and that type of situation that we have today, nowhere to be found in classical antiquity, nowhere to be found in the medieval period. Obviously, because it's a modern thing. It's a modern thing. Could you imagine medieval people discussing on how many genders you had? It's a very recent thing. It's not a source of a god for the Norse god or an ancient Greek god and a tale where this person changes sex and turns into a woman to deceive, and they're like, see, it's transgender. It's not. It's a different thing. It's a mythological magic power. It's a power of imagination. That's what it is. And I'm not saying that there wouldn't have been people that would have imagined that and thought, oh, I wish I could do that and turn into a woman. Absolutely. But it is completely different from the idea of a modern transgender person and what they go through as they struggle with gender dysphoria. Can we be honest about this? And it doesn't make me transphobic. It doesn't make me homophobic. It makes me life-phobic. That's what it makes me. Homosexuality is widely portrayed in ancient Roman art and was seen as acceptable 2,000 years ago. False. It depends on who you ask. This is an absolute... You see, that's what I mean. This article is trying to debunk this guy. And I agree. He should be debunked. But you can't debunk. You can't... Two wrongs don't make a right. You cannot debunk a false statement like the one that I've just attacked, Rome fell because of the gays, by adding your own propaganda, which is false and demonstrably false. This is not true. It was not seen as acceptable 2,000 years ago. It depended on who you asked. And once again, you couldn't have a boyfriend, you couldn't marry. If this was acceptable, then you could have gay marriage. Gay marriage, even though it exists in some instances, but they are exceptions. It's not a thing. It's not a thing. Professor De Mattei cooperates with the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Historical Sciences and has been awarded the Order of Knighthood of St. Gregory the Great in acknowledgement of his services to the Roman Catholic Church. All right, so yeah, anyways, that's the article. Nonsense responded with nonsense. How about that? Ooh, nonsense everywhere, noble ones. Well, that's why you're here, so that we can look at things, but respond with facts, not with opposite propaganda. Thank you for watching. See you tomorrow.